Good Tuesday to you again, everyone in Gov 603. Welcome again to week 3 review of the discussion questions from week 2. Boom. Let me get the last of the coffee. Now, I am your sufficiently caffeinated instructor. Okay, so this is the second video in which we go over what we did last week. And, I highlight answers that are on the right track. And so if your answer is not in line with the one that I highlight, then, go back, look at the material again, make sure that you're getting out of it what it is that I'm hoping that you get out of it, because whether it's a definition or a true or false or a short answer, by way of discussion, these will pop up again. That is, the things that we covered in the discussion will pop up again on the midterm and the final exam. Okay, so you want to have that. Okay, let's get right into it. Last week, sort of like this week, we took a look at definitions. That is, terms, again, is sort of giving us this foundational basis with which to go ahead. We're actually, in this class, we are going to get into some empirical research and give you a chance to do some. But as we wind up to that, from week 2, we looked at defining terms like theory and hypothesis and causal relationships. Okay, so question number 1. What defines empirical research and why does it need a design? Cynthia, you went first, so let's take you first. Empirical research is defined as an investigative methodology that utilizes structured observation to gather real-world data in order to answer questions. Yeah, they could be research questions. Excuse me, I got a little itch in my nose. They could be research questions. They could be hypotheses, which we're going to get to. Research must have a design because a lack of a design can lead to misinterpretation of data or gathering bad data, or incorrect assumptions, that is, as to where do you go to get the data. The design must be tailored to specifically answer the research questions or conclusions will be incomplete at best and altogether inaccurate at worst. Correct. For whatever your project is, I strongly recommend that you start with a hypothesis. Even if you're not gonna prove a hypothesis, start with something in which a hypothesis, you're making a prediction about a causal, one thing causing the other, a causal relationship between two events, whatever that means, and we call these events variables. All right, and then starting with that will inform you, if you're going to use a survey, what kind of questions have to be on the survey. Because if you make a statement about a causal relationship between two variables, you're going to have to gather information about the first variable and the second variable. You're going to have to gather information that speaks to the cause of one variable to the other. So it's easier to design your research if you start with a hypothesis and then sort of work your way out from there. Now, normally, it's sort of in writing, you start with a big idea and then you sort of work your way towards the center with specific topic sentences, and structured paragraphs that turn into pages, et cetera, et cetera. My advice to you as researchers is do it the other way around. Start with a hypothesis, which is at the center, and then start building out from there. All right. That's in my experience as a empirical researcher. That is what I have found to be the most productive and most useful and best use of my time. Okay. Question number 2. Why is it hard for some researchers to see their blind spots? And oh man, is this a problem today? Not just empirical research, but especially when you get into political science. Not just the researchers, but the practitioners of politics. I mean, some of them have a constituency that they're trying to appeal to. So they create blind spots. So there's things that they just don't see and they don't talk about, but we're talking about research here. So why is this hard? Jacob, let's go to you. I like what you're up to here. It's hard for researchers to see their blind spots for 2 main reasons. 1, ignorance is often blind to the researcher, meaning the researcher doesn't know what the researcher doesn't know. Or this is worse, All right. And by the way, in terms of midterm and final exam, stuff that we cover here in these discussions, that's fair game. So they don't know what they don't know, but what is worse is they don't take any time to find out. And we refer to that as premeditated ignorance, which is the worst of intellectual crimes. Not taking the time to find out what you don't know is the surest way to not be able to see your own blind spots. So number one, ignorance is often blind to the researcher. And number two, the academic community doesn't foster a culture of intellectual humility, or in many ways, intellectual curiosity. There was a paper published, I guess it was a couple of years back, that did a review, of studies published in the social sciences, and it found that somewhere on the order of slightly north of 2/3 of those studies, when conducted again, according to how the study was described in the paper, resulted in wildly different outcomes. In other words, they couldn't be replicated. All right? Something's going on. Either somebody is fudging the results, or they build blind spots into their data and their whole research process that they just don't see, and the academic community doesn't want to know. Many journals, many publications have an agenda that they're after, and sort of open-ended questioning. Hey, what about? Doesn't go on a lot. But back to you, Jacob. In his article, "Intellectual Humility: The Importance of Knowing you might be wrong," Brian Resnick states that people fail to understand that their versions of the truth is simply an interpretation of reality. People perceive the world differently because their brain uses fundamental senses to create a reality based on what the senses experience. Once the brain creates reality, people become overconfident and fall into naive realism, or feeling that their interpretation of the world is the truth. And in the science of how the brain works and how we come to conclusions, we call this confirmation bias. Now, it's not that reality outside of us changes. No, reality is a fixed entity, right? I mean, I can imagine this thing is made out of styrofoam, but if I throw it over my shoulder, it's going to hit the floor and shatter because it's not made out of styrofoam. Okay, but what the author is getting at is that individuals develop their own bias, and then they look for things that confirm that bias, and they don't pick up on information from things that oppose that bias. And unfortunately, in our digital world, in our digital information sphere, there's a tremendous amount of pandering to the individual bias. What you see if you spend any time on YouTube, all right, well, what you see on YouTube has been filtered to play to your bias, because they want to sell you stuff. And they want to sell you stuff by having you look at videos that have ads stuck on the front of them or embedded in them. Same thing with your Google search. There's a careful record kept of what you search for on Google, and that is mined to see what your bias might be, or your Amazon, purchases. And all of this data is often funneled into central databases and then sold, and sometimes sold to political parties, to other tech companies like Facebook, that then sell it to political parties. So they can look for your confirmation biases and push that button. This happens to researchers too. Okay. And as a researcher, you need to be careful of your own bias and not seeking out data that presses your confirmation bias. Here's, and I want you to remember this, because you may see this again, a wink. All right. My encouragement to you: learn how to be an investigator, not an advocator. Now, I'm not saying you don't have things that you're interested in and stuff that you're going to advocate. That will come out in your research design papers. That's not what I'm saying. Learn how to be an objective investigator. Go where the evidence leads you. This will make you into a stronger and more effective advocator. If you come at your advocacy, whatever it is that trips your trigger, whether it's in political science or somewhere else, if your advocacy drives your investigation, you are building blind spots into your investigatory process. But if your honest and open investigation becomes the driving force of your advocation, and sometimes the answer to a question that you might have about something is no, okay? What you want to do is get to the heart of why it is that something happens, not why you want it to happen. Okay? If you develop that as a skill set, excuse me, that will make you a stronger advocator. So remember that. Strive to be an investigator, not an advocator. Okay, question number 3. Let me take a little water. A little tickle in my throat. How do you formulate a hypothesis? How is a hypothesis different from a research question? Create a hypothesis and post it with your answer. Now, what I meant by this is I didn't mean for you to post an answer to the hypothesis. I meant for you to post it with your answer to the question. Okay, Natalie. And again, if I mispronounce anybody's name, send me an email. I'll get right on it. Okay. Based on the readings from chapter 4, a hypothesis is an explicit statement that proposes a relationship between variables. All right. Now, remember, a causal relationship between variables. It's an educated guess about how an independent variable might influence a dependent variable. Okay. Now, for week 3, we're going to be reading about different kinds of variables, and pay attention to those too. Now, depending on, some European researchers use different terms than dependent and independent, but don't get thrown off. It means the same thing. The independent variable is the event, in and of itself that you're studying. The dependent variable is what you're wondering how it causes. Okay. A hypothesis needs to be empirical, plausible, specific, consistent with the intended research design, and testable. It should be general in nature, applicable to multiple occurrences rather than just one. Yeah, but you don't want to make it too obvious. I mean, or, you don't want to hypothesize about things that are commonly known. Like the more a dog is happy, the more it wags its tail. It's like, oh, really? I wouldn't have guessed. Okay. Additionally, the units of analysis specify the type of political actor or entity that a hypothesis is addressing. Okay. So, Natalie, let's take a look at your hypothesis. Does the implementation of microfinancing programs in low-income communities lead to an increase in entrepreneurship and economic empowerment, ultimately contributing to a reduction in poverty levels? Okay. Good start, but we're going to give it a little bit of a tweak. So we're not picking on Natalie here, but everybody pay attention. So a hypothesis predicts a causal relationship. It should not ask an open-ended question. So if we were to tweak this again, we would say, here's our hypothesis. The more microfinancing programs are implemented in low-income communities, or if we wanted to put it in research speak, we could say, the implementation of microfinancing programs in low-income communities is positively correlated to an increase in entrepreneurship and reduction in poverty. All right, so did you get that? So we would say the implementation of microfinancing programs in low-income communities is positively correlated, meaning it causes it, positively correlated to a rise in entrepreneurship and a reduction in levels of poverty. Now, how would we test that? All right, well, we'd go out and set up a design in which we took a look at communities in which there was microfinancing, and we looked at the poverty level, and we come up with some definable measure for entrepreneurship, and we looked at its level prior to the implementation of the microfinancing and then after. And then we took a look at communities that never had any microfinancing, and all those would be our controls, and we compared the results. Okay, that would be how we would test our hypothesis. Now, again, to be an investigator, not an advocator, if the answer is no, that the implementation of microfinancing programs does not positively correlate to a rise in entrepreneurship and a reduction in the level of poverty, then we'd answer no. We would say the hypothesis is not supported. All right. Now, it's interesting in some circles of research, empirical research, they only say a hypothesis is supported. But let's say in this case, so if we found that yes, introduction of microfinancing reduced poverty and raised entrepreneurship, then we would say H1 is supported. But let's say that we found that introduction of microfinancing does not raise entrepreneurship or lower poverty levels. We would say the null hypothesis is supported, meaning, back to the statement of the hypothesis, implementation of microfinancing programs in low-income communities is positively correlated to a rise in entrepreneurship and a reduction in poverty, not null hypothesis. That's supported. All right. So if you're reading through research and it says the null hypothesis is supported, and you're like, what is that? That's what that means. Okay. Question number 4, why should good research begin with a literature review? And again, my apologies to you folks over in section 02 that I deleted your answers to the question. I do not know why. Listen, briefly explain the elements of a good literature review. Okay. Petrina, let's take you because we'll take you first because you went first. You say literature review is a vital part of good research and should be conducted before starting any new project. It establishes existing knowledge and context of the topic to help researchers better understand what has already been studied. Exactly. Think of it like you're entering into a party and you come into a room and there's a conversation already going on. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm really interested in that. It's in your interest, your best interest. Just stand and listen. Hear what's being said. So you don't go, oh yeah, and you know what I found out? And everybody's like, oh yeah, dude, we just talked about that 5 minutes ago. Okay, and then you put your foot in your mouth, as the expression goes. Okay, they've already been studied. Spot potential gaps in the literature and refine their research questions or hypotheses. And that second one, Petrina, that you point out is extremely important. As researchers, I want you to look for the gaps. Look for things that haven't been covered. Look for things that when it was covered, there were major portions left out. This is where you can step in as a researcher and make an important contribution to the field. So look for the gaps. Okay. The components of a comprehensive literature review include scope and focus. Clearly define scope by specifying objective research questions. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but Katrina, Katrina, you hit them all, boom, 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 right on the head. Okay. Search strategy, source selection, synthesis. Okay. Critical evaluation. On this last one, I want you to pay attention to when you're doing your literature review. You just got to put the work in. Start by reading the abstract, okay, when you're looking at articles to see if it even pertains to what you're doing. And then get to the methodology section. If like, okay, this researcher is doing something that's important to me. Skip down to the methodology section. See what sort of methodology they employed. Did they do what they said they were going to do in the abstract? Look at their data. Look for their major conclusions and finding, and try to suss out if they gathered their data well, if they handled it well, were there blind spots built in, is there biases? Be critical. Just because something is in print, that doesn't mean boo. And just because something's published in a journal doesn't mean it is, a reliable source. It could be full of bias and blind spots. So be critical. And then finally, gap identification, uncover unresolved questions or gaps in published literature that your research aims to address. Yes, exactly, Petrina. That is exactly what I want you to do, everybody. Look for the gaps. Okay, good job. Again, my apologies for deleting that. Please go back and fill that in again. I want everybody to have in their head, and answer that question because you will see it again in another form. All right. Okay, folks, it's a short week this week, but, keep on keeping on. You're doing great. Make sure that you've got the sheet for your research paper because the first part's coming up towards the end of September. All right. So I will see you on campus. I think about you. I pray about you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye-bye.